Good morning, everybody. I am so thrilled to be here today with Willow Meili. Willow is the co-founder of the Grief Well. She serves as a death doula, a grief tender, and facilitator of tender spaces. Willow is also a hospice and bereavement volunteer at Victoria Hospice. Welcome, Willow.
Hi, Tracy.
And for those of you that aren't aware, I am also a co-founder of the Grief Well. So Willow and I have had this beautiful blossoming friendship workship that we have been engaged in for how many years has it been now?
4?
4 years.
Is that true?
Yeah, I think that's true.
I think
So
it's
Willow,
true.
we meet every Wednesday. Today is a Wednesday. So we're piggybacking on a Grief Well meeting. And we go old school. We talk on the phone, and we have created the Grief Well, which is a beautiful, compassionate communities initiative that serves to create more space for people to be in kinship with their grief and also share their grief in community. So you can check out the Grief Well, www.thegriefwell.ca. So it's so exciting to be here with Willow because I love you so much and grateful you're here.
Thanks for having me, Tracy.
It's so funny. It's like playing pretend kind of. Okay, so we'll jump right in, Willow, with the first question. Can you just share a little bit more? You've got some beautiful titles that you identify with, but a little bit more about what you do to support the dying and their people.
I show up as a grief tender and mainly as a facilitator. So, facilitating groups, small groups of folks who come together to share their grief. And sometimes that looks like just a community grief drop in circle. Other times that might look like a book journey where we read a book together. I co facilitate those with a friend and therapist, Rebecca Luttrell, and we over a period of time read a book together with a group and meet every other week and share our grief and share our experiences. And then through the Grief Well and all the work that we do there for resourcing folks and what we are creating and almost about to birth into the world, some big projects this year and next. And then as a hospice volunteer, showing up on the unit. And now I am showing up more in the bereavement services space. So volunteering in my local community to help facilitate community coming together for grief support and also working with one-on-one individuals in my community as well. So
Beautiful.
yeah.
Yeah, beautiful. It's such
Yeah.
a variety of offerings that you provide.
Yeah, it is. And I also would add too, um just in everyday life, like showing up and being willing to, when I'm at school pickup or drop off or in social situations, like be having holding a willingness to be able to talk about grief, to acknowledge it, and to help people recognize and normalize what it is that they're going through just in their everyday lived experience. Because as much as we all go through the experience of death grief, there's also many non-death losses and grief associated with those as well. So,
Mhm. I
yeah.
love that. You just are in your circles, providing grief literacy, grief
Mhm.
competency, and like you said, just that naming. I think so
Yeah.
often when it comes to grief, people experience the experience of loss, but they, like you said, unless it's like a clear death related loss, it can lead
Yeah.
to confusion. I love that idea of just being there on the ground level and having these day-to-day interactions with people and knowing that those are big shifts, and that's really how we change culture, or one of the ways we can change culture.
It's so true. And I've noticed even in my friend group how more and more friends are associating with their grief
Mm.
because they have language now. And so, and through my casual like, sprinkling of it in, but just like more and more girlfriends who show up for a call or a connection, and they naming their grief, naming their losses. And to me, that it just like my heart swells because language is so important, and being able to acknowledge the things that are happening in our lives is also so important. I mean, this whole experience of life is just continued losses and gains and losses and gains. And so, it's real.
Real.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, can you share a little bit about the path that led you to this beautiful work that you're doing today?
Yeah. Really, it starts with how I came into this world. My mother is a griever. She lost her parents at a really young age. She was 7 and then 12. And she grew up in this culture, and at that time where there was almost no grief literacy or acknowledgement, and she really walked a hard path in her life. And so, because of her experiences of being parentless and at such a young age, and then eventually starting a family of her own, I think that grief has always been around me. I think unexpressed and unacknowledged grief has always been around me. And so I grew up very sensitive, very empathetic, very aware that there was so much more going on than what was being said to me and told to me. I distinctly remember my mom's narrative when I was a child. I had a lot of questions about a lot of things, especially her family and where she came from. And her narrative for me was always, when you're older, we'll talk about it. And as a child, I didn't comprehend what that meant. I took it for the face value of what was being said. But I can look back now, and as I got older and older, and really realize like she couldn't have those conversations with me because she didn't have the tools to be able to talk about her dead parents, talk
Mm.
about her experience of growing up from age 12 until coming into adulthood without parents. And so it's been really interesting to reflect back and put all these pieces together. And then I experienced a lot of losses in my childhood, and it was actually the birth of my daughter that opened the floodgates for so much remembering within me of the losses that I had experienced and the grief that I was carrying, as well as what it was like to be raised as a child with a grieving mother. So that all sort of led me down this wild path of working with myself and my own wounds and my own healing, and also acknowledging that part of that, of healing myself and healing my lineage, has been that I want to, and have the passion and drive to support other people as they acknowledge the losses and grief in their lives, whether they're death losses or non-death losses. So
That's just wow. Thank you for
yeah.
sharing that. And that makes
Yeah.
a lot of sense. I do want to say that the first time I met you, well, maybe not the first time I met you, but Willow and I actually met fittingly in a book study of Francis Weller's The Wild Edge of Sorrow. It was during COVID, and there was quite a large group of us that were spending 11 or 12 weeks working through this beautiful book on grief. And I just remember being so drawn to you because there was just something so different about you. When you shared, there was just this slowness and this depth. And then I don't know, you just had this ability to be present, even though it was virtual and I'd never met you in person. There was just something very different about your way of being that I could even sense over Zoom. And that really drew me to you. And just a bit of a backstory, after the end of that group, I reached out to Willow to see if she would be interested in offering grief circles for the End of Life Doula Association of Canada. because she had shared with the group that she had a background in facilitating grief circles. And so she did say yes and volunteered her time for the association. And I popped in on one of those grief circles. And to this day, I've never experienced anything like it. There was a lot of spaciousness, such a gentle, tender approach, a lot of silence. And, there's the term holding space is sort of a buzz term right now, but I would say that I've never experienced being held, like my emotions being held and being honored to the depth in which you did for me that day in that grief circle, like ever. Like you really do have this beautiful ability to do this, to create a container and to allow people to feel held. I was actually expecting you to talk about the grief work you did with Wendy and all those dots. But
Yeah.
when you start that far back, it really makes sense as to why you have the ability to offer that depth of space for people, because clearly you've held it for yourself.
Yeah, thank you, Tracy. I mean, I have held it for myself, and I have fortunately, unfortunately, been holding it for the people closest to me my whole life, and I'm sure I mean, and I know through my own experience in therapy, there are a lot of things that, were not exactly healthy around me holding that kind of space for my own mother growing up. And also, like, that was our experience. And because of the personal work I've done and personal work she's done, I think that this is a part of my story. It's a huge part of my story. And it's easy to say, well, my first training in grief support was at this time, which was a very meaningful training. And I learned so much. But it really does start at the very beginning of my life. And I actually have asked my mom for permission to be able to weave that into my story and the telling of my story. And she is so gracious and beautiful and like, yes, of course, like anything you want, but it's important because yeah, as a child, it was too much to hold. And yet it gave me something that allows me to be able to do what I do right now in a really healthy and clear way for myself and the people who I have the honor of supporting. So, yeah.
Can you share a little bit about your yoga background? I don't think we've
Mhm.
touched on that and sort of how
Mhm.
that led into your
Yeah.
woven into your grief work and what you do now.
Yeah, in 2012, I started training as a yoga teacher. I studied in Vancouver at Prana Yoga College, which is no longer, with my teacher Shakti Mai, and practiced and studied with her for several years and went on to teach casual classes. My foundation was in traditional hatha yoga, but then went on to also study and train in restorative yoga and yin yoga, so I was really drawn to like the slower practices. And then after I had my daughter, we were living in Boulder, Colorado, and I was experiencing a lot of grief. And I was going through my own past experiences, and a lot of old unprocessed grief was coming up. And I found a teacher there, Wendy Black Stern, who led grief specific yoga classes and offerings. And so she decided to do a teacher training, and I jumped right in and did her first ever teacher training and learned her method of yoga for grief. Mindful grieving is what she calls it, and went through her training. And that just really fed my ability to be able to offer movement with grief support. And while I don't, teach those classes, if I'm working with people one on one or even in groups, will often suggest movement. And so, because of that background, in the somatic movement of yoga and being able to make the connections between processing an emotion and feeling and holding emotion in our bodies. My training with Wendy really was phenomenal and foundational in that piece, because all of my traditional yoga training, it wasn't about what's happening inside of me and this is where I'm feeling it and how do I process it out. So being a student of Wendy's really helped me make those connections. I was already making them within my own body and my own yoga practice, but I didn't know how to, at the time, offer that to anyone else, to guide people to that within themselves. And so that working with Wendy connected those dots for me. And then I went on to work with her in her nonprofit called the Grief Support Network. And that is where I learned how to facilitate groups, and it was a huge stepping stone for me in what I'm doing now. So yeah.
Thanks for that, Willow. Okay. So, Willow, can you share a story, perhaps a story about the work you do, or a client, or a situation that somehow changed you or surprised you?
Yes, I can share a story, but it won't be about an individual per
Okay.
se. I think because my path has been working with groups before individuals, facilitating grief circles with groups before anyone started reaching out and asking me, hey, can we work one on one together? So I would just share that the power of being together was something that I wasn't connecting into being a part of, the collective healing journey. What I mean by that is it took me probably about 6 months of leading weekly community grief circles during the pandemic, where bringing people together and just sharing what's going on in our lives. And throughout that time, some weeks it was a lot of death loss. Some weeks it was a lot of just like, oh my gosh, I'm living through a global pandemic and all of the losses that are happening within that, because that was so varied for so many people. And so with being able to have the opportunity to sit and witness people, and I think the biggest takeaway, and it wasn't really a surprise because when you think about it, it totally makes sense, but especially here in North America, where we have this hyper focus on the individual and just being out for ourselves and just so individually driven, and that being like hammered into us our whole lives in this culture, it
Mhm.
was such a big, powerful experience to sit down with people and witness what happens when 10 people show up in a Zoom room together and people are showing up and they're just undone and they're nervous to be there. They don't know if they're coming into the right space. They don't know what they're doing. They just know they need to be somewhere and they show up. And when you give them the opportunity to share what's on their hearts, and then each person goes around and shares their individual experience, whether it's that day or about a particular loss, and you start to witness the connections that happen, where my story doesn't have to be the same as your story, but I can see myself in you, and the settling and the relief and just the humanness that I got to witness in those first months of being a facilitator was beyond any surprise or gift or anything that I could be given. And that is the foundation of what now drives everything that I do and want to offer out, because we truly do need each other. And we're so separated. We have so many distractions in our lives that separate us from each other, when like what really most of us need is to just sit down and talk with a couple of people who don't want to fix our situations, because that's key too. It's like we all go to our friends and our family and everybody wants to help and support. Hopefully you have people in your life who want to help and support you, or one person or whatever it is. And it's, of course, for most of us, we want to fix someone's problem or someone's issue. And so to be in a container where that's a rule, like you may not fix, you may not comment, you're just here to listen to each other and be quiet with each other and then share yourself. That is like, we need more of that.
Yes, thank you, more please.
Yeah.
And I really wish that was something that more people understood, because I think it's a real barrier to people accessing grief support in a group setting, be it in person or over Zoom. And by the way, Willow offers both in person and virtual grief support. I really wish more people understood, at least I can only speak for the way that you facilitate, because it obviously isn't true for all, but
Mhm.
just what it can offer. And in the circles I've been in with you, just having that permission. If you want to share verbally, great. If you don't want to share verbally and you're more comfortable with silence, great. And let's all take silence and sit with what's been said. And the generosity and the connection that is felt is so deeply soothing. It's even hard to put words around it. My experience of it is that it's something that I was craving so deeply, but I didn't even know I was hungry for it. And then
Yeah.
you get it. You get this group of people where there's no room in the room for ego, and people are speaking from their hearts. And you're just like, we need more of this. And you hear people say that. You can have a container like that, and you almost want to stay there longer, because when you hang up that Zoom call or you leave that room, that it's you almost have to be different in the real world, or unreal world. I would call those grief circles the real
Yeah.
world. I just wish that there was more of an understanding. It's not this dark, scary, you take the lid off and you can't put the lid back on, kind of it's going to swallow you thing. It's the opposite. It's soothing to be able
Yeah.
to finally release what it is that you're holding,
Yeah.
and to have others around just go, yeah, I'm here. I'm feeling with you. It's the medicine.
Yeah, and I think we have this hierarchy in the grief space that happens where people, we compare our losses with each other. And oh, well, I my loss is only this and their loss is that, or my loss is this and their loss is that, whatever. And these circles, like, that's all, none of that matters. There's no this is worse than that, because it's not. It's an individual experience. And I think that's something too that participants walk away with is, wow, this is the loss that I'm going through. But then when I heard this person's story, even though my loss is so different, I really saw parts of my experience. When they said this thing, I can so relate to that. It's humanizing. It's like bringing us back into this space of like, we are all so connected and it doesn't matter the details. It's we are connected and you really can relate to anyone. You just have to like listen, because
Yes.
there's a piece in there, and at a time where there's so much divisiveness, it's it's we just have to pause and listen to each other.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah.
I love you. I love you.
Thank you. I love you too.
So, Willow, if there was one thing you would want the dying and their people to know, what would it be?
Well, I don't know that there's one thing. I think that that's a really hard question to answer for me, because the process of dying is so individual and each of us are going to experience it very differently. And, I think in the death and dying communities right now, I see a huge emphasis on planning, lots and lots of planning, planning is great. And the thing that I don't want to get lost in all the planning, and you and I have talked about this a bit too, and I've been thinking about this a lot lately, is having conversations. And so The one thing that I would say is it's going to look different for all of us. And we need to be talking to each other. We need to be talking to our loved ones. We need to be talking, whether that's family or chosen family. And of course, there are the very bureaucratic things like your medical plans and, your estate planning and those kinds of things. Luckily, there are amazing people out there who do want to do those things and they have binders for you. I will never hand you a binder. But what I will hand you is the opportunity to learn how to have conversations with your people so that you can talk about the things that really matter to your heart. So, beyond your estate planning and all of those plans, talking to your people about, what would you want your death to even look like if you had a choice? What would you want it to look like after you died with your body? Do you care about how you're celebrated or not celebrated? I know there are some people who have said, I don't care. If you want to do a funeral, do a funeral. If you want to do a celebration of life, do that. I'm dead. I don't care. But that is a recognition of what do the grievers, what do the mourners of my life need? Other people absolutely want to be involved in that process. They want a certain kind of music played, they want certain spaces, they want certain people. So I would just say that it is really important for us to think about our death and to daydream, which I know is so weird to say with death as the topic, especially in this culture. But we need to daydream our deaths. I mean, I have moments where I'm listening to music. I love music, it's a big part of my life. And a song will come on, and I'll be like, I want this played when I'm dying. And I have a list in my phone. The other day, I was reading a memoir, and she was at the end, the author gives her, best death. And she asked that everyone in the room give her an applause as she dies. And I was like, "Ah, I don't want an applause. I want a standing ovation." Like, I want everyone to stand up and clap and cheer and, like, and then I want everyone to just, like, dance it out. So things like that, and that's the thing. We can have these conversations and laugh and
Mm,
be joyous and also allow tears to come to our eyes. And it doesn't have to be this big, scary, daunting thing. You know what's scary and daunting is you dying and then your family or your chosen family having to like go deal with a funeral home because no one's ever talked about anything.
yeah.
That's daunting. It is not daunting to have a cup of tea or a glass of wine, or over your next holiday family dinner, someone bring the prompt of, what do you want your death to look like?
Yeah, that's
um,
end of life planning, isn't it? Just those
it really
everyday
is.
conversations. Yeah.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
thing is, all it takes is one person, one loved one to have heard you, or to who you hand your list written on a piece of legal paper to, and you're like, here you go, this is what to do. That's enough. It doesn't have to be notarized.
It doesn't have to be notarized, but I will say I did end of life planning recently with my mom, and I am her medical representative. So she has appointed me legally to be her voice if she can't
Yeah,
speak for herself.
yeah,
And I thought, okay, if I am ever in that position, I do want things written down because I know I'm going to be very emotional. It's going to be challenging. So we did a combination of writing things down. We played some games and I took some notes, and then we made some videos. I actually asked her some questions and I just did a video on my phone because I thought if I'm in that moment, I don't know if I'm going to be able to remember this conversation, but I do really honor what you said. It doesn't have to be notarized. And I love what you're saying. It can be every day. We can weave these big, scary seeming conversations into our everyday conversations. It makes me think of my
yeah,
son. He's 19. And we were sitting on the couch not that long ago watching a movie together, and there was a scene of a woman in a long-term care facility or a care home. And he looks at me and goes, Mom, would you ever want to be in one of those places? And we had a conversation about that. And I sat back after and went, that's end of life planning. We
Yeah.
are talking about my wishes, my values, my beliefs. And I think so often people get caught up in that it has to look a certain way or there has to be this
Yes.
certain process. But I wholeheartedly agree with you that what's really needed are just more conversations.
Absolutely. Yeah. Even with my 9-year-old, like we'll be on a walk and admiring a flower or something. And I'll say something like, oh, you should plant those around my grave, and we laugh. And I'm her mother, and she is used to grief talk and death talk. And, it's integrated. And she usually rolls her eyes or she'll give me a giggle. So, learning the language, like seeking our own literacy around grief and death, in this case, death, and starting to weave it into our everyday language as a positive thing, And I know culturally we have so much work to do, and there's so many reasons why we're so afraid of death. But the truth is, it's coming for all of us. We don't know when. It is a precious thing, and it's also not, because it's happening to all of us. And so we get so caught up in like, oh, I don't want to talk about that. I don't want to go there. And I'm in my mid 40s. And so a lot of my people, their parents are starting to really age, and they're having to have conversations and make decisions. And so we're having more conversations, and I just am trying to lighten it a little bit by have the conversations, talk about this, because with your family members, with your parents, and just really try to help normalize that this is real for all of us and that it is going to look different.
Okay, so let's dream together for a moment. So, looking ahead on the horizon into the future, what do you think is needed when it comes to supporting the dying and grieving? And how do you see us meeting death and grief with more acceptance and grace in the future?
Um, I mean, if we're dreaming, then I feel like I can say the things that I want. Because if I try to weave them into reality, they seem impossible. I would really like a very huge reckoning around our fear of dying and death and our obsession with staying young. I think that growing old is a privilege, and we have been seduced by this insane narrative that staying young is the only way to be, and that that's where our value lies. And really, that seduction has come from companies, beauty industry, fitness industry, wellness industry. And so it's all an illusion and a seduction. The reality is, aging is a privilege. If we have the privilege of planning our deaths, the privilege of even having, what one may deem a good death, that's huge. And so I would love to see a reckoning just in that knowing for people. I would love to see culturally that spell be broken, and an acceptance and an acknowledgement, and then an acceptance of we're all going to die. And so, how would that shift how we live? And a deep understanding that how we live is how we die, because it's only going to help us all on our healing journeys and our path to whatever is waiting for us in life. And then I also think that I would really like to see death and grief come out of the shadows. I would like for grief to stop being held as this big, scary monster, but there's so much more to it. The work that we do with the Grief Well, really encouraging people to develop a kinship, a relationship with their grief through relating and being in practice with their grief every day, And the same with death, building a relationship with the fact that you are going to die and working at that every single day, and being open to the possibilities of how it may change how you're actually living right now. One of the things that I love and don't love about all of the time we spend on social media and online is, yes, it exposes people to things that they are not otherwise exposed to when it comes to grief and death. And also, the waters can sometimes feel murky, and like the potency of these experiences can get watered down. There's a balance with vulnerability in online spaces, and I think that matters. I want for people to be inspired in those spaces, but I struggle with how things can be cast aside and made not that big of a deal depending on what you're seeing. I think that's my dream. Does that make sense?
So
I
much
kind of
sense.
all over the place.
Oh, I followed you there. It was okay to wander a bit.
Cool.
And I think people would be really surprised in this happiness obsessed culture, in this death phobic culture. People would be really surprised to understand that in order to be happy, you actually have to be sad first.
Mhm.
That in order to live more fully, you actually have to contemplate your death. It's actually very life affirming, and I wish more people knew that, because I've seen it in real time in the work that I do, guiding people into these conversations and being with people in grief. And you can in real time see this lightening happening and this like increased life force that's available when we don't have to use it to repress what is inevitable and human and natural and part of
Yeah.
all of our lives. So I'm definitely right there dreaming into that with you.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting when I started volunteering at hospice on the unit and, sharing that I was doing that with family and friends. And so much of the response is like, oh, that must be so depressing. That must be so sad. And I like really struggled with those comments because I would literally walk out of the hospice unit from my shift and
Yes.
feel like more alive and emboldened and just like in love with life
Yes.
than I've ever felt like in any of the other things that I've done in my life,
Yeah.
and which I know to so many people, they don't understand that. How can you be around all these people who are dying and feel that way? But there's,
Mhm.
because you are in the distillment of the essence of life right there, and it makes you not want to waste any of it. It is
Yeah.
all so precious. It's
It's
so
also precious, which is your business name, One Precious Life.
yeah.
Yeah, I agree. Like go do a shift at a hospice and then go watch the sunset, like knowing that the people you were just with hours before will never see that sunset or
Yeah,
a sunset. Like that sunset takes on a whole new level of beauty.
it does. It
Yeah.
does. And I would say being in service,
Mhm.
whether it's hospice, whether it's, once a month with some other community organization in your community, whether it's with the SPCA, like it doesn't matter what you're doing, but that being of service, being in service, I think is a balm that our culture is really missing right now. There's so much talk about, the younger generations and everything they're going through and lives spent on technology and all of these things. And my thought is always like, these kids need to be volunteering, these adults need to be volunteering. And, it may seem like this has nothing to do with death and grief, but it does, because it goes back to that happiness obsessed culture and our fear of sadness. And then when people are sad, they're constantly trying to override that, and they don't have the tools or know what to do for themselves, and like going and volunteering somewhere and
Mhm.
interacting with people in your community can really be a huge balm to that experience. And it connects you with people of all age ranges in your community also. I think it's very important to have friends who are elders. It's very important to have friends who are young.
Mhm.
Having a span of people in your life also gives you that distillation
Mhm.
of the essence of the preciousness of all of this, and it gives you that experience that we're having in community grief circles, where my story is really different from yours, my loss is really different from yours, but I see myself in you you
Yeah.
know
Yes, all of that, that we need each other and that service leads to gratitude. It's so different
Mhm.
than the inequality that comes with helping or fixing. And it's so relevant to why we're here because the term doula actually translates into a very ancient word that means servant. And a lot of people have trouble with that
Yeah.
word, and that's okay. I know it can be loaded for some people.
Yeah.
Personally, I really identify with it because of what you're saying, what the byproduct of service is gratitude and it is connection, it is community. So I love that idea. I'm going to get on my kids and get them to serve in some way. I'll let you know how that goes. We know that we can talk all day, but I should probably bring our tender conversation to a close.
Okay.
So as a way to close us out, I have this little deck of gratitude cards by theschooloflife.com. And just like we do at the Grief Well, we're going to end today with a little note on gratitude because when we talk about death and grief, it's nice to be stretched by gratitude as well. So these are little cards, they're little tiny cards. They have beautiful images on the back, black and white images. I'm just going to shuffle them and I pull one. And here we go. What's the image? Oh, it looks like a sculpture of some sort.
Mhm. Some bodies intertwined.
Yeah. And it says, we once really turned someone else on.
Fun.
I'm so glad I pulled that one with you. It was good. All right. Well, thank you so much, Willow, for being
Thank
here
you.
today and for
Oh,
sharing everything you do. And if you want to find out more about Willow, you can look into our show notes and know that she offers her services both in person and virtually. So again, thank you so much, Willow, for being here today.
thanks, Tracy.
We'll see you next Wednesday. Bye for now.